Okay, let's start. Good morning, everybody, or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. I'm Marina Gorbis. I'm Executive Director of the Institute for the Future, and I've been leading, along with my colleagues, this project called Equitable Enterprise Initiative, which we started a couple of years ago, but it's really a continuation of a lot of previous work looking at and doing research on what's happening with work, what's happening with inequality, what's happening with wealth and income distribution, and all kinds of other things. This work has been supported by 5 foundations. It's Ford Foundation, Hilton Foundation, Irvine, Robert Wood Johnson, and W.K. Kellogg Foundation, for which we're very, very grateful. I'm excited to be sharing this work. This is the first time we're doing a public webinar like this and introducing you to our fellows and to some of the why we started this work and some of the deliverables, some of the things we're coming out and finding out. I want to give you a little bit of an introduction to as to why we started this project. As I said, we've been looking at changes in work and the impact of technologies for over 10 years now. And you're probably all familiar with this kind of data and seen it, which is that we are facing large and growing income inequalities. And if you look at kind of the percent of where the corporate profits have been going up, almost like exponentially, actually, in the last 10 years or so. And as you can see, the employee compensation has not kept up as a percent of gross national product. It's been going down. There's interesting data that also shows that actually, if you look at revenues from companies, from corporations, that a smaller and smaller percent of their revenues is spent on workers. Most of the revenue and the larger part and growing part is going to their shareholders. This is research by Rick Wartzman, who is at the Drucker Institute, and he looked at 5 largest companies, but they're representative of the whole sort of domain. And largely it's due because of buybacks, corporate buybacks, which inflate share prices and other things, subcontracting, outsourcing of work, spending less on workers in general. And when I look at it, I kind of think, well, it may not be a problem. It wouldn't be a problem if shareholders were getting a lot of returns if we all were shareholders, if shareholding were more equally distributed. But there is this unfortunate data that indicates that actually stock ownership is highly unequally distributed. Most of the shares on the US stock exchange are owned by 10% of the population. That includes in mutual funds and all kinds of investment mechanisms in general. So when the stock market goes up, most people are really not affected by it because they're not stock owners. So by itself, this sort of switch to shareholder primacy and that driving a lot of corporate organizations wouldn't be an issue if we were all shareholders and shareholding were much more equally distributed. But we don't have the companies like it used to be that when you worked in a large company, most likely you owned stock in that company. Most likely you also had a pension plan. So all of these things have been sort of disappearing and resulting in these kinds of inequalities. And on top of that, we're seeing this incredible rise in one-person businesses. This is data that came out recently on new business applications. And it shows that top line is actually the number of one-person businesses. It's kind of businesses that do not plan to hire employees. So it includes all kinds of people. It includes people who are influencers, who are choosing to do this for various reasons. But it also includes people who have no other choice but to work in this way. And the problem with this kind of work, gig work or independent work, informal work, is that it really does not provide people the kind of assets that create longer term economic security. most people do not have access to healthcare, to retirement benefits, to stock ownership, and all of these other things. So between what we've been seeing on the corporate side and switching kind of costs, spending less on workers, delivering more to shareholders, to these emerging new kinds of work, it's something for us to worry about, because if it continues on this path, we're going to be facing even larger income and wealth inequalities. And so there are different sort of narratives, I would say dominant narratives about why this is happening. One of them is it's about technology, it's about automation. People are basically automated out of jobs and they're replaced by machines. And so that's the cause. It doesn't seem to be the case, actually, if you look at the data. And the other sort of reason that people often cite, well, we don't have a skilled labor force. We don't have enough people filling these jobs that are out there waiting for you, which again it's one of these, I call them zombie ideas. It's ideas that have been disproven by fact, but they refuse to die. We have the most highly educated population in history. If you look at the number of degrees that are being granted compared to 1960s, for example, the growth has been very, very high. And I'm reminded of Martin Luther King quote that skills are the result of work. They shouldn't be a prerequisite to work. So these narratives are kind of, I would say they're kind of faulty narratives. And the more we've been studying and looking at what's happening with work and jobs, it's really, we need to look at the root cause of it. And the root cause of it is really kind of the business structure, the way business and corporate structures are organized, that is really making work which used to be the main means of sort of dividing prosperity and achieving prosperity, broad prosperity for the population, that work today is not delivering that kind of wide held prosperity, distributed prosperity for a lot of people anymore. And the reason that is so has to do with the nature and the sort of business form and corporate form and the whole kind of shareholder primacy and regulatory environment and policy environment that enables that. And that's kind of the bad part of the story. That's worrisome, right? But the good part of the story is that the way we work and the kind of business structures we create are not preordained. They are the product of political, cultural, historical circumstances and design. And the good thing about it is that we can redesign it. For example, if you want to think about technology that's causing these shifts, you have to look at Germany, where, for example, Uber operates very differently. The same technology, the same platforms, but they have to work through unionized drivers. In England, it operates very differently. So it's not just about like, this is the way things are. These technologies are shaped, they are regulated in different ways, they produce different outcomes in different political and cultural settings and in different countries, and that's what we're seeing. And so what we believe, as I said, we don't believe that the way we work is preordained or that the business forms we have preordained. They're really products of design, they're product of social cultural norms. You know, at one point, slavery was the main way the economy depended on that, obviously became unacceptable. It is a product of the kind of technologies we have. It's a product of regulatory regimes and power dynamics and labor availability, all of these other things that are basically our levers for shaping a more equitable work environment and ultimately a more equitable enterprise. And that's really been the focus of why we created this project and why we created this initiative, is to look at what are the ways that we can create more equitable forms of enterprise? What are some of the actions we can take? What are some of the levers we have that we can sort of push to achieve more equitable outcomes? So that's really the reason for this project. And we recently released results of this research in a kind of a form of a map. If you know IFTF work, we oftentimes produce these, a lot of research in the form of a visual map with a lot of data and a lot of research, but it kind of gives you at a glance view, synthesis view of what is the terrain. And in this case, we looked at, if you look at these large sort of pentagons, it's the levers that we saw in our research and conversations with experts and others, all of these different levers that we can pull to create more equitable outcomes. So it's about the capital, it's about the labor organizing and the way labor is organized. It's about education and what people learn. It's about technology and code, and it's about community, all ownership, all these other things. And as we are been doing this research, as you know, we oftentimes look at signals, things that our people are doing today that are signals of hope, the kind of future we want to see, signals of possibilities. And we brought a group of fellows as kind of our signals. These are people who are doing things on the ground. They're creating equitable enterprises. They're pushing these different levers. They're engaging in actions that result in more equitable enterprises. And that's really important, that it's not something, people are doing this work already, and people have been doing it for a long time in different ways. But a lot of this has been sort of on the margins. We don't read about it in the Wall Street Journal. We don't read about this a lot of times in the main business press. We don't teach it in business schools. There are very few case studies of these equitable types of enterprises, but they exist. And if you look at this map, it provides description of these levers and what they do, and examples, signals of people who are doing it on the ground today, because giving us kind of pathways and learnings for the larger, for diffusing this knowledge in the larger world. So I'm very excited to introduce you to a group of our fellows who are working in this, who are pushing the envelope, who are creating equitable enterprises or engaging in actions to create them, and share with you some of these signals, some of what they're doing, how they're thinking about it, why they're doing it, how it connects to equitable enterprise. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite one at a time, our fellows, to share with you what they're doing. And then we will bring them back as a group for a conversation and discussion. So let me start with Esteban Kelly, who is Executive Director of the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops and does many other things. And let's start with you, Esteban. I'm going to stop sharing, and so we can see you. So
Hi.
Let's start with you. Tell us about your work, about the Federation of Co-ops, why co-ops, and also how does it connect to equitable enterprise?
I mean, it's right at the heart of equitable enterprise, and hopefully that's pretty clear to a lot of the folks who are zooming in today. So first of all, good morning. So happy to be connecting with everyone today, and to talk a little bit about the work we do. So the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops is the only national grassroots membership-based organization for worker-owned cooperative businesses in this country, and we're organized pretty similarly to other worker co-op associations and federations around the world. We are pretty comprehensive in terms of the different industries that the cooperatives are in, demographics, even the geographical regions. But what unites us is that we're all trying to build a social solidarity economy that really flips the relationship of capital and labor on its head, back to what a lot of people were doing in the early labor movements in the mid 19th century, right? That's actually where unions and worker co-ops have a common ancestry in that one movement. And then of course they sort of went in slightly different directions, and throughout history have come back together at different times. I know that there's some folks here from the labor movement participating today, which is great. So we organize not only through 100% democratically elected board that then oversee me and the rest of our staff. I've been the executive director since 2015. But then we, in addition to running programs and technical assistance and really trying to build out the institutions we need for workers to thrive as we're developing new businesses, as we're finding good ways of running the businesses once they're established, and also being the purveyors of some of the worker benefits that workers would otherwise get in a traditional relationship directly from their employer or through bargaining for that through a union. We end up having to step in to help create that infrastructure and an economy of scale for all the different cooperatives to access things like health or dental or vision benefits, some retirement benefits, cost sharing through insurance and things like that. So in addition to that leadership structure where we're accountable to the hundreds of cooperatives in our membership who then elect the board, we also have those members participating directly in 5 member councils, which are usually co-chaired by someone on the board and someone directly in the membership that's not on the board, and then supported by staff. So there's a union co-ops council, a policy and advocacy council, racial economic justice council, one that's focused on immigrant workers, and our newest council is an international council. And it's really a site for both advancing the mutualism and internationalism and municipalism and some of that agenda around building a social solidarity economy and a community of learning, but also representation, that it's where we build our pipeline of leaders and are paying attention to our relationships bilaterally with all these other countries and regions. So through that work, I ended up on the board of the International Worker Co-op Association called CCOPA. And then it's funny, we used to be the ones that were playing the most catch up in the US to catch up to where Argentina was at, or Italy or Spain. And now we're actually helping other associations in different parts of the world, particularly in the UK nowadays. And we're also learning along the way that we have a lot of knowledge and pedagogy to offer to some of the more established worker co-op ecosystems, because we come from more of a US based political organizing culture that centers, Freirean pedagogy and participatory structures, and also an intersectional analysis. So that's some of what we're also taking appropriate leadership globally in some of that work.
I wonder, where do people go when somebody, I'm here in Silicon Valley, right? I bet like when somebody starts a company, co-op is not what's first come to their mind. They think like, oh, I'm going to go to a VC and I'm going to get venture capital. And then, there's a pathway there. There's all kinds of lawyers and accountants and others who can help you, and consultants along the way. Where do people go to learn about a co-op and how to run a co-op?
I think that's the most important question for this conversation with this particular audience, because, of course, there's the stuff I was just saying about just backfilling the infrastructure we need for worker co-ops to find each other, to thrive. We collect data, we do training, technical assistance, all that stuff, right? That just sort of needs to happen in the background. But what's interesting is this question of the origin story of worker co-ops. We've been tracking longitudinal data for how many of them started as startups versus conversions, so really transferring ownership from an established, traditional, usually small business to a worker buyout, and then redesigning the bylaws and the governance and management so that workers are managing the business, and then ones that grow either through franchise or some sort of incubation, or through a vertical supply chain where maybe there's a business that decides to spin off one of their departments into a co-op, or to instead of purchasing some of their inputs for their business, to just create the business that's dealing with the agricultural side or the packaging or some other aspect along that value chain. And part of our work in stewarding that ecosystem is helping to grow the network of many of the nonprofits or community development financial institutions co-op professionals, like the lawyers who would be involved in the deal space around this, to make sure that all of those things become easier, that it shouldn't just be that it's about upwards of 70% of worker co-ops are just started by people themselves as entrepreneurs. So it often means that they don't have access to capital. They're starting in usually service sector industries that don't require a lot of capital. My co-op started that way. I was 30 years old when we started Aorta. And it was just through a portfolio of clients and our own, knack
But
for
it's not
political
something
education.
like you can, that's not something that's taught in business schools. In most business schools don't teach co-op management, creation.
That's true. Right. Most of them don't. Most of them don't. And it's funny because a lot of the things that we end up teaching once the businesses are started are a lot of traditional things about financial literacy, and some of it is then we do our work and take it beyond that to a post-capitalist model for open book management and things like that. But yeah, I think in terms of getting capital together, these are one of the things that I've been working on with our colleagues with the National Co-op Bank, the National Cooperative Business Association. You're already teeing up the case that Trinity is about to make for public banking. Say,
this is perfectly
and even working with groups like Transform Finance, who are working with that divest invest space. Like, what are we doing with capital once it's being divested from fossil fuels, from all the problematic portfolios of endowments, and whether those are coming from student campaigns with the endowments on universities, or from shareholder activism. Do we have the infrastructure to even absorb those things, right? And so that is the other half of the work that we're doing, is figuring that out, and also working in the policy space to structure those things. We shouldn't be penalized in the capital gains, for example, of what it takes to finance a worker buyout. We should be able to capitalize these pools, and we have a program through our sister nonprofit, the Democracy at Work Institute, that's really looking at a legacy business investment fund, right? So how do we capitalize this fund that can actually do the buyout itself and then resell it to the workers? And that way the owners aren't impatient and just looking for the most expedient buyer, which might be a monopoly corporation in their industry. But we can actually do that, and we can foreground a racial equity agenda within that. And so a lot of that work is specifically not just for workers of color, but really looking at Black workers in particular, and ways that we could advance the model through those mechanisms.
Okay, that's great. So you kind of keyed us in to go into capital and money and funding for more equitable enterprises. So let's bring in Trinity Tran, who is a real amazing organizer and leader in the public banking movement, and has been leading this effort and legislative changes in LA in particular, but in California overall. There's just been legislation passed that allows creation for the first public bank in LA. So Trinity, to you, public banking, what are public banks and why?
Well, hi, thanks, Marina, and hi, everyone. Just a little bit of background on who I am. I'm a grassroots organizer, a co-founder of Public Bank LA and California Public Banking Alliance, and these are both two all volunteer organizations we founded in 2017 and 2018. And in the past few years, we've been really focused on grassroots coalition building and as Marina mentioned, legislative and citizens lobbying across 10 cities in California. We've worked with elected officials and at both the state and the local level, and we've created two public banking state laws. These were two bills, first in the nation bills, historic bills that were passed in the California state legislature in 2019, and then also last year in 2021, as well as multiple pieces of legislation in LA City Council, as well as cities across the nation. And what these bills do is what the first bill does, the California Public Banking Act, what it does is it charts a path for cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, for municipalities in the state of California to be able to form their own banks. These are banks that are owned and accountable to people. They're publicly owned. They operate as nonprofit corporations, and they leverage funds to be able to reinvest public funds back into our local communities. And the fight that we're fighting here, this epic battle that we're fighting, really evolved out of Standing Rock and the fight to divest from big banks who were financing the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2017, and that was an oil pipeline that was being built on indigenous land. So since DAPL in 2017, activists from LA, SF, from the East Bay, across California and across the nation are now pushing cities which hold billions of taxpayer dollars in Wall Street banks. They're pushing these cities to divest from these big banks and divert those funds back into the communities to finance social goods like affordable housing, green energy projects, green energy infrastructure, co-ops, which, as Devon mentioned, provide financing for small business, small minority-owned, immigrant-owned businesses who can't access affordable rates through traditional lenders. Public banking, at the heart of it, really is about mobilizing our public funds and leveraging it so that we can fund positive and local projects that are actually accountable to our local communities. And our work in California really is centered on, and this is the mission that drives our entirely all volunteer coalition. Our work is centered on building a network of socially and environmentally responsible banks whose lending priorities are, of course, focused on sustainability, uplifting marginalized communities. These are projects that will actually benefit our cities rather than diverting our funds and having Wall Street banks leverage it to finance destructive projects like fossil fuels and private prisons. So how this connects to an equitable enterprise, I think at the end of, I think inevitably it really comes down to controlling the flow of money and from where money originates, to whom it benefits. I believe this is really central to building an equitable world when you can have deposits that are made locally, the decision-making process behind where investments go are made locally, being able to control the money supply and determine the lending priorities at a local level is really important to put that power in the hands of community members rather than private, out-of-state, disconnected private bankers. So right now when our cities want to fund projects like build roads, build bridges, schools, we have to turn to private capital we have to turn to private markets for financing. So nearly half of what we pay for the end cost for an infrastructure project goes towards paying the interest and fees to private Wall Street banks. So what we're doing is essentially cutting out Wall Street as the middleman. And when you put banking in the hands of the people, when you remove that profit motive from the mandates of a bank, we have the potential and of course the resources to be able to create a world that's actually centered on local pressing needs, that's centered on things that we need at a local level. So it's about mobilizing our public funds to fund public goods, and that's utilizing all the taxes, the fines, the fees. Every time we pay sales taxes or we pay the fines for a ticket on our car, that goes into public coffers. That right now is leveraged by private banks to fund things that counter our priorities in the community. So this really is about aligning our public dollars with our values and empowering Main Street. And I think that's a really important tool for being able to invest in an equitable world.
What's the hardest thing in terms of like selling this idea of public banks, either to legislatures or to citizens or to people? Because, we've been told for decades now that private sector is more efficient, it's more innovative. Everything public is sort of inefficient. And what do you've been talking to people, you've obviously been in a lot of conversations with people and also legislators, what do you think is the hardest thing for people to think about?
There are many challenges. I mean, at the end of the day, we're building a financial institution from the ground up. So this has been an uphill battle the entire way, and it took an incredible amount of technical work and it has, and it will continue to take an incredible amount of technical work to build out an institution, design policies, and to kind of create the rules around how public money is governed, and to do that in a way that's democratically and representative of the interests of local communities. So, I mean, just to put it in context, the only public bank in the nation is the Bank of North Dakota. It was founded in 1919. That's over a century ago. It's more profitable than Goldman Sachs, better credit rating than JP Morgan Chase. But so that was done over a century ago. So here we are 100 years later, trying to introduce or reintroduce this kind of obscure concept back in the mainstream. So it took a lot amount of work to be able to coax legislators into believing this concept, and in doing that, we had to build a big broad-based coalition. We had to engage a lot of institutional power, like Democratic parties and local elected officials and delegates across the state, and to be able to move this idea that could have been seen as more fringe, and move it into the realm of respectable public policy. So now that we passed 2 bills, as in California, as the 5th largest economy in the world, I think that's done that did an amazing job in accelerating the public banking movement, because now it's legitimized as an idea. But it did take a tremendous amount of public pressure, both among our 200 plus coalition organizations in our coalition, hundreds of members of supporters across the state, citizens lobbying teams from 10 cities, and working with legislators from the inside who had strategic conversations with senators and assembly members. Because to pass a bill in the state of California, you have to move it through. We had to move it through 3 committees in the Assembly, 3 committees in the Senate, both the Senate floor and then the Assembly floor, back into the Assembly floor. So you've got all the way through, from the start of a bill's introduction to when the Governor Newsom signs it, you have about 3, 6, 7, 8, 9 opportunities, 9 hurdles for the Wall Street lobby to overturn and kill that bill at every step. So it takes so much focus, and that's why we have to be very laser focused in our organizing to be able to walk that bill through every single hurdle. But done it. We've continued doing it as an unfunded organization. So I'm very hopeful for the future. And there's a lot of amazing developments happening right now. We just 2 months ago, LA City Council just issued a request for proposal to hire consultants to write the business plan, which is the first step per the AB 857 California Public Banking Act law we passed. So we passed the law, we created the legal regulatory framework, and now it's an implementation phase.
Kudos to you and congratulations. Very, very exciting. Yes, there's some questions that you can answer, I think, as we proceed, and then we'll take more questions later. Okay, thank you, Trinity. And let's go to Phila. Phila Townsend is she's a scholar and activist. I really like that title that she uses. She's finishing her PhD at Rutgers School, and a lot of her work is really looking at new forms of worker organizing, connections between new technologies and labor and impact on labor. She's been particularly studying worker centers, which I don't think a lot of people know about. So Phila, share a little bit about your work and connection to Equitable Enterprise.
Sure. Thank you, Marina. And I always love coming into spaces and literally learning so much every time I talk to my fellow cohort members. But so yes, again, I'm Fela Townsend. I do often want to start by talking a bit about why I identify as activist scholar activist, because I think it's important to frame the work that I do, how I view the world, but also I think in terms of this conversation around equitable enterprise, it's for me what I think is really at the heart of what it means to be equitable. But so when I say I'm an activist scholar, it means that I intentionally work across research, advocacy, and policy work. And, we often talk about sustainability or equity as sort of outcomes or ends we're desiring to achieve in the world. And we're not often talking about justice. And so my work is fundamentally grounded in that. And what it means is, I think it's bringing a frame of repair. And that means acknowledging that the inequities that we're often trying to work to address come from injustice, right? They come from systems and policies that were intentionally created to exclude, or they have the outcomes of exclusion. And so I think that's just a really important thing to name. And the other part of it, right, is it's making people whole, right? It requires seeing people and communities as whole beings. And I think when you do that, it really means bringing a particular lens and way you think about power and how it operates in the world, which is why I love the work, that the map shows, and what, this whole Equitable Enterprise project is about, is looking at these different levers of power and thinking about what needs to be shifted, what narratives need to be changed, what counter narratives need to be elevated. So I just wanted to sort of ground in that, because I think it's really important and not often named in these conversations. But in terms of speaking about my work, you gave a really good overview of how my work tends to cut across many domains. So it means I don't have to necessarily go into them. And I will specifically talk about two pieces. Yes, in terms of Black worker center research I do, but also I do want to talk about another report that I was a part of, because I think it brings a really good frame to thinking about the landscape of worker organization, organizing, and what's been happening, particularly in recent years and probably even the last decade. So yeah, I just finished up with a team of other researchers, a report of labor researchers that pretty much highlighted what I think people have been seeing and talking about in some way, but I think it's important that we sort of bring it together and bring it description, and we quantify it a bit, so really this report was trying to look at what's been happening in the landscape of worker organizing. And what we found was that we are at a moment in time, arguably a historic moment, where we're seeing increasing diversity in the groups of workers that are organizing, and we're seeing increasing diversity in the organizational forms in which it's taking place. And so that sort of begs this question of what does this mean for the future of labor and labor organizing? What does it mean for the future of our society? But it also means, I think, what has it meant, right? For why are workers sort of, I talk about it as like taking up their own sort of tools, their own power resources, and doing whatever it means for them to build power. And so what it means is not everyone's trying to organize or be a union. We see an increasing number of worker centers, and I'll get into that, but there's about, I think, 246, 7 give or take, so almost 250. 15 of those are Black worker centers, and we've seen more of the growth in the last recent years in Black worker centers. But workers are voting with their feet. I mean, we know about the Great Resignation that we're seeing. We see walkouts happening, strikes, right, protests, right? So there's this question of like, what does all this mean? You look at my colleagues, building of co-ops, creation of public banks, right? To me, all of these are forms of worker organizing because they're workers coming together to build power in ways that are meaningful to them in their communities. And so it raises big questions for us to think about one, how do we support and sustain this work? Not just through policy frameworks, although that's incredibly important. I think it's important to name a lot of worker centers have emerged in recent decades, frankly, because it was a place for workers who are largely of color, immigrant, and women who fell outside of the boundaries of labor law and policy.
Can you just tell people what a worker center is for those who don't know?
Yes. So a worker center is essentially a community. They're often community or place-based organizations that are focused on addressing various kinds of employment issues for workers. Most workers in them are low wage or don't work or unemployed. And they don't do the work of you. They're not collective. They're not trying to create collective bargaining agreements. Although, contrary to what many people think, they work often with unions, right, to build power alongside unions. And many of them do feel that their work is about trying to get workers access to better jobs and to union jobs. So yeah, sorry, thanks for pausing me there, because many people actually don't know what worker centers are. But yeah, I just think that, like, going back to this point about why worker centers are important, and also just looking at this broader landscape where we see this increasing diversity, I think it's for us in this room, hopefully, that are about trying to support, whether it be in funding or whether it be in providing the kind of information and critical analysis that's needed for folks that are trying to, like, grow and build these organizations. It's important to think about not only what's needed to support them in ways that they see as meaningful, right? So it might be about giving funding or capital access, but it's important to understand, and I hope we can maybe get into this in the later part of the discussion, what are ways that are most meaningful for the organizations that they're building? I guess the last point I'll just make, Marina, and we've seen this in the ethnographic work that the Institute's doing, right, is that a lot of people that are building at the community level, whether it be a co-op or their own form of organization or organizing to unionize or to do whatever it is that workers deem as appropriate for them, what we're seeing is they have this ultimate vision, right, of what they want the world to be, but what they lack is the appropriate economic, financial, and other structures to operate in. And so I see it as our role here is to figure out, how do we make it easier for workers to do this? And are we really supporting workers in ways that will actually shift the power imbalances that create these inequities and injustices that we're hopefully trying to address? So I'll end there. I don't know, Marina, if you have follow-up questions.
And you said the reason what's important about worker centers is because they operate usually outside of unions. So they kind of show a pathway for organizing, and particularly as the number of sort of gig workers or independent workers increases, there's a real need for those voices. In our ethnographic research, that's what we see, people living really in an atomized way. And so there is no kind of social support, there's no learning there. So they become much more important. And these alternative ways of organizing, not surprisingly, they're growing.
Yeah, and I think there's two things about that are important to highlight. So one is that these organizations, so my research is actually looking at, like, why they exist. Like, what is a Black worker center? It sounds like a fundamental basic question, but really it's about sort of unpacking the environment and conditions in which these organizations emerge. Why do that and not some other form, right? And so there's certainly alternatives to unions, and often it's because the workers that they're meeting the needs of or that comprise them don't have access to unions to this point. Whether it could be that they're a contractor, it could be that they're unemployed, it could be that they, don't think that they would have the kind of support necessarily from unions. But it's important to see that in many cases, and this is what I found in the work that I've done with looking at the LA Black Worker Center, There's an emerging hub in Southern California and Inland Empire and in San Diego. I think there's one coming in the Bay Area. What I'm seeing is that I almost think of them as an octopus with tentacles, where they are working with all of these, not just community organizations, municipal and state organizations. Worker centers are often operating at this hub where they're at the intersections of all these other kinds of pathways of power building, of power, of policy advocacy, and giving services to workers where there are no other pathways for workers to get them. So they're an alternative, but I almost see it as like it's a both and actually we need more worker centers, and we need more unions, and we need more co-ops and all of these other kinds of organizational forms.
Right. Great. Thank you, Fila. And last but not least, Mia Birdsong, who is a writer, scholar, educator, facilitator, many things. She's a fellow at the Economic Security Project, who's one of the founders, was a fellow at the Institute many years ago. So Mia, share your work.
Hi. I love listening to y'all. Let me just say that first. And I'm really glad to be here. So I have a wide-ranging body of work. I think the place I'm sitting in right now is the organization that I'm the executive director of, which is Next River, which is an institute for practicing the future. We're part culture change lab, part think tank, part ecosystem builder, and we do research that reveals solutions for our future being practiced at the margins of our country. We nurture leaders and leadership models that point us toward our collective vitality, and we recast fundamental concepts like freedom, like work, to kind of unshackle them from the status quo and breathe new life into them. So we're moving conversation and culture and resources to nourish people and communities and ideas whose ways of being and doing and relating kind of point us toward a just and liberated and joyful future. In our mind, capitalism is not part of that future. And when I think of capitalism, I'm not just thinking about an economic system, I'm also thinking about the culture of capitalism. So in order to extract as much as it can from everything, but in particular in this case from workers, right, for the least amount of cost, capitalism, which is infused with these kind of American ideas and identities and notions of work, has socialized us through culture, right, to believe that our value as people is derived from our productivity. And the indicator of that value, the way that it lets us know that it values us, is by paying us. So first of all, we have a whole class of workers who uphold capitalism by working without pay. So I'm talking about like people who do care work, usually in their homes, mostly women, without pay. And we devalue that work by not paying people. So this is how the system kind of demonstrates that it values something, right? As with paying you. So it's saying that like the work that people are kind of doing without pay is not actually valuable, but we actually rely on it. So there's that piece. But this other piece is that capitalism has most of us, and I would say the vast majority of us, even those of us who have an analysis of this, has us believing that we need to earn our human rights. We need to demonstrate that we are worthy of the things that we need to live. So in order to get access to food and housing and education and care, we go to work. And in this context, our jobs are the sun around everything else, around which everything else in the like galaxy of our lives revolves. It's how we structure our time, it's how we structure our energy, it's how we, like, our priorities are largely dictated by the space that work takes up in our lives. And for example, you have a job and you have hours that you are supposed to work. Those hours are kind of anchored in your day, and then everything else that you need to do in your day has to happen before or after those hours. But the job hours are like kind of the immovable center. So when I think about the idea of equitable enterprise. It's not about how do we all get equal access to this system that we've set up. It really is about how are we decentering work in our lives and putting ourselves in the context of our connection to other people and the rest of the planet, like at the center. So in my work, I'm thinking about elevating, right, a life-affirming understanding of our value as people. And it's one that says that we are worthy because we are here. We are worthy because we exist, and that we don't have to earn our right to what sustains us and sustains our lives. And we can't unearn our rights to those things. So that our systems, when I think about like what we want in the future, our systems of economy, of governance, of education, of care, of home, of food, that those systems should all affirm our life, right? They should hold sacred and prioritize our well-being instead of prioritizing our ability to hoard resources, instead of prioritizing growth for the sake of profit, instead of prioritizing efficiency for the sake of profit, things like that. So instead of approaching work and workplaces as solutions to think, as our kind of solutions, I think we need to look at workplaces and work as actually taking up less space in people's lives, so that we're moving work from this center to one of the many planets that orbits our lives, in like practical ways. And I think we're this is one of the kind of positive signals I'm seeing, is like literally just instituting 4-day work weeks and 6-hour work days, right? So that work literally takes up less of people's time and they have time to build their lives outside of work. It could be recommitting to understanding 40 hours a week as full-time, which means that like you don't go above that. That's the ceiling, not the floor. So setting up a workplace so that people have, we know people are going to be sick or go on vacation or leave work, and that the remaining people may have to take on additional work, but they shouldn't be going over 40 hours. They should be going up to 40 hours, right? So I think about those as like really practical ways of how we can decenter work from our lives and kind of, again, making it an orbiting planet. It could look like, it could look like a lot of things, but I just wanted to give like a concrete example of what it might look like for us to decenter it. I think in the part of what I love about my my role in this is that a lot of the work that I did for a long time was around economic justice. So I was looking at people's access to capital, which in the context of capitalism obviously gives you access to the things that you need in order to live. So I kind of came in backward to work that I do now, which is looking at the spaces outside of that, looking at the cultural context that we live in, and thinking about, I think what Phela was talking about, which is like, how do we see people and communities as whole, and understanding that labor and the work that we do for money should not actually be the kind of primary thing that we're looking at in people's lives, but we're looking at a whole range of things that make us whole.
Yeah, it's really, do you feel like, people are doing that, right? We're reading the Great Resignation or whatever, that people are, and just the nature of us working from home in some way decenters the office and decenters that kind of identity. So are you hopeful about that? But my other question for you is that whole notion of decentering work and decentering kind of that worker identity. In some ways, it's a very hard one to talk about, even in sort of progressive circles. Like if you think about the union movement, and it's all about worker identity, and so much of the work of organizing and advocating for worker. So it's like, it comes like right perpendicular to that.
It's really, yes. And I think this is why when I say even those of us who have a critique of it have a hard time with this, because we have such a deeply internalized sense of our worth from productivity. We see productivity as a virtue, right? I mean, this is something that is fundamental to America, right? Like the work ethic is something that we like take a tremendous amount of pride in. Productivity is something we take pride in. We derive our sense of value from it. So it is a challenging thing to unpack. And I think we are peeling back layers of it. And part of so there's that part that is really hard, right? I think the other part that's challenging is just that folks have a hard time imagining capitalism ending because it feels so, big and ubiquitous. And there's pushback against like the idea that people want to make like better capitalism, which I tend to equate to kind of the idea of people who wanted to make slavery like less crappy, right? Like better slavery. But there are all of these signs of hope. I mean, I feel like, certainly in my Instagram feed, in addition to kind of the Great Resignation, there is also a shifting narrative around like what you owe your job. So there are people like reminding each other to like work as little as you can. You're earning money for some wealthy person, right? Like you're barely getting what you need for yourself. So like, don't do more than you need to. And people reminding people again that their value is not derived from productivity. There is a whole movement around rest and our kind of birthright to rest, and this idea that you don't actually need to work in order to like be worthy of rest, but that like rest should be something that is just like a regular part of your life. And I want to make sure I give a shout out to Tricia Hersey and the NAP Ministry as really being in the forefront of that movement. I mean, I have been in a ton of kind of organized, funded conversations about post-neoliberalism and the future of democracy and the changing of work. So I feel like there's also this very, kind of institutional response to all of this as well, and thinking about like how do we create a more just, liberated future for ourselves. There is a lot of, I feel like there's an increasing interest in work that focuses on cultures of belonging and our kind of inherent human need for connection and belonging. I wrote a book that came out in 2020 called How We Show Up. When I think about the ongoing response to that book, the continued interest in that book, and then there's a whole bunch of other books that are focused on this work too. That also feels like a positive signal to me. There's also I feel like there's also been this increase in interest in Octavia Butler's Parables books. There's a musical about the Parables books. There's some podcasts. There's a project that
because the world is beginning to remind us that it looks more and more like that.
Oh, absolutely. So, which is like horrifying in some way, but I think part of what I feel like Octavia taught me is that our dystopia and our utopia come from like the same disruption, right? Like that you can't get to the utopian part without shit falling apart. And that like our effort right now is like, how do we survive the falling apart? And then what's on the other side of that? And like, who do we need to be? What do we need to leave behind? What do we need to learn and kind of understand how to do? In order to recreate things on the other side, or build on the other side in a way that doesn't recreate what we've left behind. Right. So all of those feel like really positive.
Others to come into this conversation because you touched upon a lot of things that I would love to hear others come into this. Particularly this point, actually, like it looks like things are falling apart, right? And there's a need to envision what's on the other side, right? So one thing I'm interested in your guys, and I just, Esteban just posted, you created some scenarios for the future, alternative scenarios, which was really interesting to read, but how do you think about it? Like where does that envisioning what's on the other side, Octavia Butler and kind of futures work comes in? How do you see it?
I couldn't agree more about that being a really strong signal. I mean, it was a weak signal over the last decade or 12 years, and it had been building. And I think it was already starting to kind of mainstream that people were really digging into that literature prior to the pandemic. And I think in 2020, it just was like, we're all in on this. And it, in fact, it shot back to the top of the New York Times bestseller list, Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. And I think there's a few reasons why. I mean, part of it is that the world in which her protagonists are living and struggling to survive is one coincides with these years. Like it happened in the 2020s, a lot of the plot in those novels. And people forget this, but Butler was citing the Ronald Reagan campaign around Make America Great Again, which is actually where Trump stole that from in his campaign, because Americans have amnesia, and everyone was like, oh my God, brilliant marketing, this guy. Couldn't remember that like a mere 35 years prior. But that's where she sort of saw where jingoism and revanchism and authoritarianism could lead. And then of course that confluence, people being like, wait a minute, we're living in this world that she foresaw. And I think actually we forget that she wasn't trying to be prophetic. And she spoke about this in interviews before her passing, that she actually was just doing real good futurism. She was doing real good foresight. And she wrote these books as cautionary tales, saying, if we don't make different choices, if we don't intervene, if we don't become self-aware, right, this is where book burning will get us. You know, this is where,
similar to Margaret Atwood, who said she didn't write Handmaid's Tale she wrote it as a precaution, right? And here we are, kind of.
Exactly. So I think similarly to your prompt about the piece that I co-authored for the summer issue of Nonprofit Quarterly, looking at visions for economic democracy and what's on the next horizon, it was taking that similar spirit, and rather than engaging with, and I love Octavia Butler. That's half of my shelf is all of her books. But rather than just engaging with like, wow, how prophetic, what does that mean about the moment we're living in? I was like, we need to continue to explore this future. Like, where are things going? And knowing what I know, having a perspective in all of the different institutions that are undergirding the future of economic democracy, where do I see this going? And how can I apply foresight in different scenarios? So not just saying, here's where this is going, and it's one scenario, but actually like there are ways that this could break for the worse, for the better, things that could look a little middling and like a version of the world we currently live in. And so I tried to use those tools to play with that a little bit and illustrate it through very plausible scenarios. I actually did not let my freak flag fly in that as much as I would like to. I was like, all right, let's actually keep this down to plausible, like very pragmatic futures. And so people can take a look at that. It's the cover story of Nonprofit Quarterly.
You know, one of the things that kind of is coming out from all of our conversations with advisors and people, we've been doing deep dives and workshops with various experts and others. And one theme that's kind of cuts across is the kind of a need to change our basic cultural sort of concepts that are so in language, the vocabulary, like what Mia was talking about, decentering work. That's like it's a really hard mental break to really grasp with that. The culture of productivity, the culture of measurement, and everything that needs to be audited and re-audited and measured, and you only trust those kinds of things. So how in your work, or how do you think about that, these kind of moving almost like into different register, as one of our advisors calls it, into different sort of vocabulary, different set of concepts? That's the most difficult thing, right? Underneath it all, like we can probably pass some laws, we can probably do some regulation, we can organize in a different way, but it's that underlining, that shift in how we think.
So I want to respond to that, and also connect it to the previous question. I see them as related. I I think it's important for those of us that are in positions to do it to help to create more space for folks that are to create more space and opportunities for rest, really just to connect it back to this conversation. I think for future dreaming and planning, and for even just being able to step back and think about what a particular concept is or means, or see its contradictions or whatever it is, right? The challenges or limitations of it. People need space and they need time. And working with a lot of folks that are in movement spaces in particular, which I think every panelist here can speak to, this idea, for me at least, of time being a justice issue is really critically important. People can't future vision and dream when they're inundated and in the trenches and feeling under attack, frankly, right? With all the things that they're challenged with, that the communities they work with and on behalf of are being challenged with. And we talked about this yesterday, right, Marina, on our call, like there's often this in-between space, right, that we find ourselves in of there's, okay, this present thing, right, that I'm dealing with, having to grapple with, but then there's this future, right, that I want to achieve, or what I want to realize, or what I want to move towards. And so I'm always thinking about how we help create more spaciousness for folks who are doing the work, right? Whether it be more resources and money to frankly just, right? And I love, Mia, for you to talk about the effort. I know that you're working on thinking about doing this for folks, but like, I just think that's a critically important thing to highlight, which is that, and which is also not a normal distribute, right? Like there, like again, there are inequities even in how we see who has time to be able to like think and plan and dream. So I just wanted to offer that.
Looking at time as a justice issue. Yeah.
I really appreciate that. Part of what I sit in a lot is that it's also about it's about time. It's also the time horizon that we're thinking in, right? And part of our ability to have kind of space and time to think is that we're not continually reacting and responding. And if you are like worried about whether or not you're going to be able to pay your rent or afford meals or pay for childcare, you're constantly reacting. But I think we can also step back and look at the left in general as being in constant reactive mode, right? We are constantly dealing with something urgent. We are constantly fighting against something. We are constantly defending and protecting against things. And while those are real urgencies, if we continue to kind of have that orientation that we're constantly reacting to a landscape and attacks from the right, we are never going to build the future that we want, because the only thing we're focusing on is what we don't want. And we actually need the room and spaciousness to be like, not what do we want to happen in the next 6 months because, the right has done whatever garbage they're doing, but like, what do we want in 20 years? Like, what is it that we want in 50 years? And if we only know what we don't want, we're going to be building a world that is in response to our opposition. And that is not going to be a world we really want to live in. It doesn't allow us to have the spaciousness that you're talking about. And I think in terms of that equal distribution, right? It requires that we think about that spaciousness as something that we obtain collectively, right? It can't be that some of us get it, because if some of us get it, we get it on the backs of other people. There's this in Clint Smith's book, How the Word is Passed, I think is what it's called. Don't just look it up if that's wrong. He tells this story about going to Thomas Jefferson's plantation in Monticello, and the tour guide talking about how much Jefferson really loved and appreciated having a life in which he could like think and write and had time to just like be expansive in his thinking and dream and read things and whatever. And that in order to maintain that lifestyle, like, money would get tight for him and he would just like sell off a slave, right? So the idea that like his like liberatory space in order to like, come up with the Federalist Papers and, whatever, he didn't write the Federalist, but whatever he wrote, that required that he was not only enslaving people, but that he was tearing people's relationships apart. He was separating people, in like, the most brutal ways that America has demonstrated, and we've repeated that. If you can talk about the schools that we created for Indigenous folks, taking children away from their families. You can look at what we've been doing at the border, separating children from their families. Like this is an American project of separation and enslavement, in order to maintain some people's ability to have like time to think big thoughts. So when I think about what that means, like in terms of equitable anything, right? It's like, how do we all have that? How do we all have our needs taken care of so that our own agency and kind of self-determination and spaciousness is facilitated? And I think we often think that there is a tension between personal agency and self-determination and the collective's well-being. And I actually think we need to invert that and be like, the collective's well-being is what facilitates our personal agency and self-determination and autonomy.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I liked where you landed, Mia, because I wanted to circle back to that transitional point from Fila and the beginning of what you were saying, and you came back to it at the end, which is just to add a little nuance and building on the idea of the spaciousness and the importance of that. Like if you're worried about housing or food security, then you don't have the agency and the spaciousness to sort of build the future that you want. Or to ideate or to resource the communities around you. And I think that there's a different call to the community that's here today, that's maybe a call to look with a little more nuance at what leadership within these movements needs, which is not exactly the same as the communities that we're embedded in and that we're resourcing and that we're organizing, which is to say, like, sometimes leadership, I think especially Black leadership, gets written out of what it is that we're saying here when it's like, whoa, this is so overwhelming. Like, yeah, like centuries of racial capitalism, of course there isn't space for bubble. But actually, there are some really important people who are at the forefront of creating space, who are able to facilitate and convene and work with communities of color and working class communities around some of these points. And it actually isn't an overwhelming step to just resource those leaders. Like people like myself should not be, and all of us are, we talk about this in our fellowship meetings, we're like busy doing stuff that we shouldn't need to be doing. And like what it would look like to just resource the organizations, the people, the leadership, bam, like so much stuff starts to open up. And it should not need to take decades of our lives to get to it, to make these like broad advances on what it looks like to move that horizon closer for our liberation.
I think, well, just, I'm sorry, I see you were about to say something.
Go ahead.
No, I have two questions from the audience.
Because I feel like there was like a bit of a opening there, Esteban, but connected to some of the things, and also something that just really bothers me a lot. And sometimes I fall victim to it too, but like, a lot of, it was your point, Marina, about like these cultural concepts and the newness. I mean, a lot of these aren't new, right? Your point, the Esteban, I was talking with the leader of the LA Black Workers Center, and we were talking about freedom, and, it's connected to universal basic income and all these things. And this idea came up where she said, in many ways, we have to work to get the base of workers we're working with, like, to these things, like whether to go to like a group of Black folks that are and underemployed and be like, oh, like, we're trying to get you to not work, or right, like there's something we have to work towards. And I asked her, I said, well, is that something where they're not there yet? And she said, no, they're there. In fact, many of these concepts, right, come from these communities. It's just that the way the system, if we want to call it racial, whatever it is, right, the capitalist system and all these other things have made it such that we can't achieve it, right? And so I think in many ways, like, a lot of these concepts are not new. They've just been marginalized and put on the fringes intentionally. And so a lot of our work, I think, is not always reminding, because some of us don't know, right? It's maybe new to us, but a lot of times it's, to Esteban's point, is going back to and elevating and amplifying the folks in the communities where a lot of these ideas, where they come from, right? Whether it be Indigenous, Black, Brown, or whatever it is, these concepts aren't new for those communities. It's just that for the mainstream, they're not conducive to the mainstream being staying in power or whatever it is. So anyway, I just wanted to say that, because whenever we say these newer things, or even like alternative, right, even in that there are embedded assumptions, right? And so anyway.
So somebody Matt in the comments was just asking a question about that. So you answered that question. And I do think that this is part of what the work that I've been doing feels so, part of one of the things that feels hopeful is like, we don't actually need to come up with new stuff. Like, somebody is already practicing all of the things that we want our future world to look like. It really is just about,
or
like,
and it in the past. Somebody has practiced it in the past.
Yes, but I'm saying, like, but it's not only that someone has practiced it in the past, it's that people are actually doing it right now, because there are whole groups of people who have been systematically barred from the status quo, from the mainstream, from the ideas of success and happiness and whatever that we have. And those folks have they've stayed closer to their ancestral lineage and memory of how we used to do. So it's not that we need to reinvent things or come up with or it's not that we need to come up with new things. It is that we need to be paying attention and learning from the people who are already practicing those things. I think, as Esteban was pointing out, resourcing, right, those folks, because people shouldn't have, like, I don't want to romanticize the fact that people who are like deeply marginalized are practicing the things that we need. Like, people are struggling too. So we need to be resourcing those and learning from those practices. And it's not about then, creating a strategic plan and some kind of like benchmarky, whatever. It is about, like, how are we building a relationship with those folks, with each other? How are we doing some of the intentionally doing some of that mindset shift to, like, extract systems of oppression that we've internalized, and moving ourselves and practicing the things that we want for the future right now, right? And I'm not saying there's not systemic change that needs to happen, but I'm saying it can't actually, we will revert back to what we've been doing if we don't actually change our collectives as well.
Are you thinking that to do that, you almost have to opt out of the system? On the map, we have like 3 strategies. One is regulate, one is opt out.
So no, we can't opt out of capitalism. Like, people who opt out of capitalism are like, there's like a tremendous amount of privilege that comes along with that. Like usually those people are like individual white men who don't have children or anybody else they got to support, and they can like dumpster dive or couch surf or whatever, and whatever they're doing relies on somebody else being kind of in capitalism. So I often think of it as that we're standing with like one foot in the future that we want and one foot in the present that we live in, and that in that place of tension between those two places is actually where we need to be putting our energy and examining and exploring, and not moving away from what's uncomfortable or around what feels hypocritical or like at odds. Like, that's where the good stuff happens, y'all. And what I find is that when we dig into that place, we can actually move ourselves closer to the future than we thought we could. We can actually find areas in our lives, in our organizations, in our communities, where we can be doing more of the future practicing than we thought. And that's actually how we get there. That is like how we move things, like from a cultural standpoint, from a like small kind of like micro systemic standpoint. Like, that's how we make that stuff happen. One of the things I talk about with people all the time is, I'm like, do you know your neighbors? Like, just having a relationship with the people who you live in proximity with is like one of those things. Like, it's, you watch each other's cats, or you borrow lemons from each other, or you give each other soup when you're sick. That is creating micro infrastructure for yourself, because the systems that we have that exist, right? That shit is functioning as it was designed, and many more of us are realizing that they were not designed for most of us. And no one's coming to save us.
A test to see how are we doing so far in March, April 2020, to just be like, oh, mutualism, like when the state shrinks, when you can't drive or get across town to a grocery store, like, where are the food hubs emerging? Who is checking on neighbors? Where are the community clinics popping up? what do cultures of care look like? And it was a really helpful, I think we're still actually trying to go back and be like, what actually did happen, and to capture economically, the conversion of things like worker centers or worker cooperatives that became food hubs and health centers and things like that. Like how community assets in the way that you talk about a lot, Marina, were leveraged on behalf of the very immediate needs. And so it allows us to baseline a little bit, because we know that even since then, in the last 2 years, so much has grown. And when we think about how much further we have to go, we do have a sense of like, what are these elements? And to the question that came up from, I guess someone was asking this anonymously, I think what Mia was just saying about the work we have to do, it's not just that it's, to Fila's point, alternative, but that it's actually the only, show me another way. Like, how are we dealing with the climate crisis otherwise? That like, we're not talking about parts per billion in the atmosphere. We're actually talking about the technology of democracy as a decarbonizing strategy, what it looks like to steward the land again, what it looks like to even recognize that our atmosphere, from the analysis that comes from indigenous organizers, has been colonized. Like that actually is what we're seeing. So the antidote to that is not going to come from striking a deal with Chuck Schumer that is backed by the fossil fuel industry. It's going to come from democratizing our economy, participatory processes, and actually having not just the means of production, but everything about how we govern our lives be devolved back into the hands of communities. And whether you want to talk about that as anarchism or socialism or post-capitalism, I think all of those things, there's space for all of that to bloom. But there is no other way that we're going to be able to minimize the harm, but also to manage and mitigate the impacts of the harm that's already been released in the atmosphere.
All right, we're sort of, we have about 8 minutes left, and I wanted to ask you each a question, which is very simple. What do you feel like one thing that would really help advance your work, and also just advance some of these ideas, like one action that you would suggest? And maybe Trinity, we haven't heard from you. This was a lively conversation, very passionate, but Trinity, let's start with you. One thing.
So one thing that would help advance our work, I think we've made, as I discussed, mentioned, we've made incredible progress as an unfunded organization. We've been really resourceful thus far, with thousands of hours of volunteer work from our coalition, passing these state bills. But I think as we move further along in the implementation phase, as we're working to build the banks, funding would definitely help us with educational content, as well as bringing on technical consultants who can help with the business plan process and working with state and federal regulators. And all of the materials that we produce, of course, would be blueprints and open source guides for sister movements across the state of California and the nation. So we've moved mountains with very little. So my ask is that if anyone here has connections within their networks of people or organizations that can help accelerate our mission, please do reach out. I can drop my contact in the chat. And then I'll also drop our resource booklet, which kind of lays out the basics behind public banking in the chat. And if you're in California, we have public banking chapters in 10 cities up and down the state. So join or support the public banking revolution.
And just on the question of time, all of this work was done by volunteers?
Yes.
Like yeah, that's a lot of work. Yep.
It's a sacred mission.
Kudos to you. Fila, you want to go next?
Yeah, I was trying to think about it in the sense that I'm not running an organization technically. We could always use more funding and resources, but I guess I would just maybe highlight, well, one, I think supporting my colleagues in the efforts, because again, I see my work as supporting people like them and creating more space for people like them and giving more awareness. So whatever they say, one thing would be to support what they're doing. But I think For myself, Marina is where actually Esteban, also one of our other colleagues, Mariella, I am involved in an effort of trying to bring worker organizations exactly like these folks here together. I mean, we had a conversation earlier about mutualism and the need where a lot of people are trying to create spaces where we create more coordination across movement, right, and intersections of movement for folks to not just come together to build community, but figure out how to get more resources and just to figure out how to build on top of and augment the efforts that they're doing. So if anyone is interested in learning more about this effort and how they can support it, feel free to reach out to me about it. But yeah, I'll end it there.
Great. How about Mia?
Fundamentally, we are not going to create the future we need by investing in, supporting, paying attention to the same people that got us into this mess. And I want to be very clear that Black, Indigenous, queer, disabled, and other marginalized people are absolutely already working on the things that we need to save all of us. And if you are paying attention to, reading, funding, supporting people besides that, you need to stop. And you actually need to put money in and your attention and focus and support into the people who are doing something that is like deeply different and probably makes us uncomfortable from what we've been doing before. Like that's it. Like we need to stop tinkering around the edges of things and look at the things that are fundamentally different. Certainly everybody in the Equitable Enterprises Fellowship is one of those people. That's who you should be paying attention to. That's who you should be supporting. That's who you should be funded. Our stuff is not going to be as shiny and like well produced as the other stuff, but that does not mean that it is not brilliant and necessary.
Great. Esteban.
I would just ditto all of that. I think what we know about resourcing, organizing, amplification, movement building is that it's social, right? It's social. It's who you know, who you're connected to, what stories you're hearing, and how that informs your perspective of what's possible, of who is leading the spaces, of who's inspiring who. So connect with everyone here. Follow us. Let us know what you're interested about, because I think the other thing about us and our organizing instinct is we want to connect you with people who are so it's not about like studying up and learning about some nerdy thing that isn't your jam. Like whatever you nerd out about, we'll find the Black and Indigenous revolutionary transformative thinkers who are working on the same thing from a very different angle and who would love to be in community with you. So get at us, stay connected, certainly follow us. I put links to the organizations there, and yeah, it's a little rough. So we could use funding and support, and even just relationships or connections to people who you know might be interested in this work. Don't worry about pitching. Like we know how to describe our work. Just tell us like who you know and what their priorities are, and I guarantee you there are cooperative solutions, there are transformative solutions to things that they already care about, like better, more efficient and effective ways heading toward their same goals. Let us do that work of making the connection. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, our fellows, for this really amazing conversation. And we're running out of time, and actually we're on time. So thank you for those of you who joined us. You can find these guys' bios and contact information. They posted it, but it's also on our website, the Equitable Futures Initiative website. And we have a newsletter. We have all kinds of, we've been doing deep dives and they're recorded. They're all on our website. So if you want to know more, learn more, and continue to stay in touch, get on the website. We also have an amazing group of advisors, many of whom I'm seeing here. I saw Ray and Cory Doctorow and Astra Taylor among them. I don't know who else is here, but they've been very generous in sharing their knowledge and their ideas. And we just have a wealth of information, research, ideas, conversations that we would love for you to tap into and know more about. And again, thank you to our funders who are brave enough to be funding this work. And that's our Hilton Foundation and Kellogg Foundation, the Irvine Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the Ford Foundation. Couldn't be doing this without your support. And thank you so much. Bye.
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 Thanks, y'all. Take care.